Dustin Crowther. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Second Language Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He is going to speak to us about speech comprehensibility in the second language classroom, what 25 years of research might tell us about classroom pedagogy. Please help me welcome Dustin.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I found my head nodding up and down a few times like, oh yeah, I guess I do that sometimes. Yeah, I forgot about that a little bit. All right, thank you for having me and for inviting me, organizing this talk. Yeah, so after Angelica's introduction, I'm Dustin Crowther, coming to you from the Mānoa Valley in Hawaii. I feel like it's been a long time since I did any kind of public speaking that wasn't in front of my students. So just take a moment to breathe in and take this new environment in. So thank you very much for having me today.
Yep, that worked.
All right, yeah. All right, there will be a couple opportunities during the presentation to ask questions. I've sort of built them into the talk. So I won't be tracking the chat box while I'm presenting, but I can take a look at certain moments throughout the talk.
And John is keeping track too. So if anybody has questions, please ask them, type them into chat as we go along, and we'll make sure to address them.
All right, so I'll start by saying the title of the presentation mentions 25 years of research and what it might tell us about classroom pedagogy. This is coming out of a, now my computer's not, there we go, is coming out of a paper that I've been preparing with a pair of PhD students here at University of Hawaii, Dan Holden and Kristen Urata. We were asked to create this timeline for the journal Language Teaching. So I'm not going to give you a year-by-year analysis of what has happened in speech comprehensibility research, but much of the literature that I'll discuss will come from some of my own research, as well as the consistently increasing body of research in this area. One thing that I do want to make clear from the outset of my talk is my perspective on the link between research and pedagogy. And so I'll just pull out a couple of quotes that I've often referred to. One coming from Susan Gass, Jennifer Bainey, and Luke Plonsky, looking at it would be counterproductive to base language teaching methodologies on something other than an understanding of how language learning does and does not take place. So by understanding how language learning takes place, we should be able to make informed methodological and pedagogical decisions for the classroom. And from an instructed SLA or instructed second language acquisition perspective, trying to conduct research that's going to provide teachers with evidence-based pedagogy that can be employed in the classroom. So ISLA research aims to look at ways in which we can manipulate the language learning process to create the most conducive context or environment for language development to occur. So throughout the rest of the talk, I'm going to run this talk in 3 stages. I want to start in defining this dimension of second and foreign language speaking that I'm referring to as comprehensibility. Once defining this dimension, talk a little bit about the research that I've been involved in this area, and then look at what this research, what kind of implications this research might have for speaking and pronunciation pedagogy. So as I mentioned, I have built in a couple moments in which you'll have a chance to sort of follow up with some questions. So basically we'll have time after defining the construct, talking about the research to ask some questions during the presentation, then of course some time at the end of the presentation for further discussion. So I am someone who believes strongly in construct definition from a research perspective. We want to have a clear understanding of the constructs that we are researching in order to allow for replicability across research, but also more clear understandings of the implications of this research. So comprehensibility is a dimension of second language speaking that falls within a larger discussion of intelligibility. So I just want to quickly reference a pair of principles proposed by John Levis in an article in TISA Quarterly in 2005. In this discussion, Levis was mentioning how a lot of pronunciation instruction up to that point had really been done within what he referred to as a nativeness principle, where the goal had been for a learner to acquire the linguistic ability of a native speaker, which ultimately came to the reduction of a second or a foreign language accent. The argument put forth in the same article was that it would be more beneficial for language instruction to focus on intelligibility, or a speaker's ability to be understood. So being an intelligible speaker or a comprehensible speaker. And we've seen a significant push since 2005 in the scholarship to focus on what allows us to be intelligible, because the research shows that we can be intelligible speakers while still being in possession of a non-native accent. So the nativeness principle assumes a prestige variety as a target language. For my research into English as a second and foreign language, this is of course problematic given the range of varieties exist, but I'm also fully aware that this same concern exists in a number of non-English languages as well, whereas the intelligibility principle places an emphasis on the speaker and the listener as essential elements. So whereas a nativeness principle sort of puts the onus completely on the speaker to sound like a native speaker, intelligibility principle, and I'm just laughing at not being able to intelligibly say intelligibility in the middle of this presentation, we're seeing that intelligibility is not just a one-way street. It requires considerations of speaker and listener. So there has been strong ideological push for a focus on intelligibility from second language acquisition scholars, so more language neutral research. And for someone whose interest is in global Englishes, intelligibility has been one of the primary constructs of interest from that body of research. So what do we mean by intelligibility? Because it can be a very loaded term. For lack of a better distinction, there's two paradigms that are frequently addressed in the literature. There's a paradigm put forth by Larry E. Smith, typically referred to as international intelligibility. It has three dimensions: intelligibility, comprehensibility, and interpretability. And then there's the Derwing and Munro paradigm, amongst many others who have conducted research within their dimensions of intelligibility, comprehensibility, and accentedness. Now, despite us seeing the words intelligibility and comprehensibility in both paradigms, they are not viewed in the same way, which can lead to confusion in the field. The Smith paradigm primarily has been referred to in English as an international language research, whereas the Derwing and Munro paradigm has been more language neutral and more focused on second language acquisition in general. So I'm going to focus primarily on the Derwing and Munro paradigm because that is the paradigm in which my research exists. But I do want to mention that there is intrigue in the Smith paradigm, and specifically in Smith's mention of interpretability, which is far more difficult to actually get at empirically in research. So in Smith's paradigm, intelligibility is referring to a listener's ability to decode the words that have been spoken, comprehensibility, the ability to understand the meaning of an utterance, and interpretability, the ability to discern the intent of an utterance. So to sort of clarify this, an example from my 3 years teaching high school English in Japan, I would often ask my supervisor, a Japanese teacher of English, can I please use the projector in class tomorrow? And I would often get the response, maybe it is difficult. So if we take this response, maybe it is difficult, and we break it up following Smith's paradigm, intelligibility, we can decode the words pretty simple. Maybe it is difficult. Comprehensibility, understanding the meaning of the utterance, well, literally, it just means it may or may not be possible to use a projector. I learned very quickly from my experiences, though, that when I heard the word maybe, it typically meant no. So the intent of the utterance, maybe it is difficult, is actually no, you can't, but it's said in such a way to help save face of both the Japanese teacher as well as myself. So you can consider it a pragmatic move in interaction. And so for me, this construct of interpretability is highly interesting, though we tend to spend a little bit less time on this construct in the research, which is a little bit unfortunate, but hopefully we can begin to focus on it a bit more. When we move to the Derwing and Munro paradigm, I'm going to mention that you're likely to hear references to both broad and narrow intelligibility. So here I'm representing broad intelligibility with an uppercase I, and it simply refers to how well a speaker's utterance is understood. It's within broad intelligibility that we find a more narrow definition of intelligibility and the definition of comprehensibility, our target construct for today's talk. So intelligibility here with a lowercase I is looking at how accurately a speaker's utterance is understood. Comprehensibility is looking at how easy or difficult a speaker is to understand. Comprehensibility is a perceptual measure. Typically, we ask a listener to indicate on a scale of 1 to 9, how easy or difficult is the speaker to understand. What's important to note here is they're both measurements of understanding, but they focus on two different aspects of understanding. So you can imagine yourself interacting with two different people having the same conversation. At the end of both conversations, you could potentially have 100% accurate understanding of what was said in the conversation, but for a variety of reasons, you may have had to have worked much harder to understand one speaker than the other. It is that perceived degree of effort to understand a speaker that comprehensibility is aiming to measure. How hard, as a listener, do I feel I have to work to understand a speaker? These two constructs, along with accentiveness, are typically associated, as I mentioned, with the works of Munro and Derwing. The timeline I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation is typically, or this research is typically associated with publication Munro and Derwing in 1995. So in terms of measuring intelligibility and comprehensibility, intelligibility is typically measured through transcription or comprehension questions. And intelligibility has been looked at a segmental level. So how intelligible is a speaker's production of this individual sound? It's been looked at a word level. It's been looked at an utterance level. Comprehensibility, as I mentioned, is primarily a scalar judgment on a scalar of 1 to 9, scale of 1 to 5. You'll see me refer to sliding scales a little bit later in today's talk. But based on the fact it's on a scale, it is by default a perceptual measure. So the question that will come up is, if intelligibility is focused on accuracy, then why are we spending time on comprehensibility when it's simply a perception, but not necessarily a representation of how well a speaker can be understood? I think Sarah Kennedy and Pavel Trofimovich did a nice job discussing this, where they mentioned how comprehensibility judgments provide us insight into listeners' in the moment understanding of and reaction to L2 speech. Generally, the argument that I would make here, and is discussed in Kennedy and Trofimovich as well, is that our judgments of comprehensibility typically are going to occur before we understand how intelligible a speaker actually is. So even for an intelligible speaker, if we find that there's decreased comprehensibility, they are more difficult for us to understand, this may elicit more negative initial reactions from a listener, which may affect a listener's willingness to put in the effort necessary to understand the speaker. So it is possible that if I find a speaker difficult to understand, I may not put in the effort necessary to realize they are actually intelligible. So this is coming from a perceptual perspective, but if we want to simplify things a little bit, we typically find that comprehensibility and intelligibility are highly correlated, which means that as comprehensibility increases, so does intelligibility, and typically speakers have been shown to be more intelligible than they are comprehensible. So if we focus on comprehensibility, which, as I've mentioned, is more practical to measure through the use of scalar ratings as opposed to the range of measures that have been debated in the field, a focus on comprehensibility should allow us to simultaneously promote more intelligible speech as well. So this is a moment I wanted to sort of just try and establish some construct definitions, but I wanted to check in to see if we have any questions about the constructs before I jump into the research. If there's any clarifications or questions regarding the constructs. And
so nothing has come in on chat. Does anybody have any questions right now for Dustin?
Terrific. Then I shall continue.
Wonderful.
Yes. All right. All right, so now that we sort of have an understanding of this construct of comprehensibility, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the research tells us. So as a quick history lesson, the timeline that I referenced at the outset, looking at publications between 1995 and basically up until today, because I just reviewed all of our journals in the last week to make sure our timeline is up to date, we found 97 studies published between 95 and 2021. Initially may not sound like a large number until you consider 76 of these studies were published post 2009. So we have seen a significant uptake in interest in speech comprehensibility in the last decade. And now, while English scholarship has been predominant, we're beginning to see a much greater focus on a range of non-English languages, especially in reference to second language French speech, second language German, Japanese, Korean, and Spanish. And while the research I'll describe in a moment will focus on my research into English, I'm going to summarize some existing findings in different non-English languages, and you'll see that really a lot of the findings are very, very similar no matter the language. So some very basic thoughts. Attainment of a native-like accent is a rare occurrence, even for learners who begin at a young age. Even when we meet a learner who we feel has speech that's akin to that of a native speaker, however native speaker is defined, their language learning is typically not going to be comparable to the vast majority of learners. Right, but we do know that speakers can produce intelligible and comprehensible speech despite possessing a strong foreign language accent. So given that foreign language or native-like accents are rare to acquire, and we can produce intelligible and comprehensible speech despite possessing a foreign language accent, we've seen a strong push towards the intelligibility principle as discussed in Levis 2005, and more recently in Levis 2020. So I'll talk a little bit about some personal contributions to this body of research. So I'm talking about 3 studies, but really focus on study 3 since it was really a combination of studies 1 and 2, in which my colleagues and I, working with Pavel Trofimovich out of Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, and Kazuya Saito and Talia Isaacs at University College London, we wanted to look at, when it comes to L2 English speech, what were the characteristics of that speech that promoted or hindered a listener's perception of how comprehensible they were, and were these characteristics affected by either the task that the speakers were completing or the first language of the speakers. So we worked with 60 L2 English speakers from Mandarin, Hindi, Farsi, Spanish, and French backgrounds. They were all newly arrived international undergraduate and graduate students in Montreal, Canada. They had varied English proficiency, though they had met the university's minimum requirements. So there was no requirement for them to pursue additional English for academic purpose classes. They were welcomed immediately into undergraduate or graduate study. Importantly, at the time of the study, there were no proficiency differences between these 4 groups of speakers. We asked them to complete 5 speaking tasks, 3 of which I report on in these studies, and they're ranked on a continuum of complexity. So the first is a long-term task in which we asked them to speak about a party or restaurant that they had previously enjoyed. We consider this to be a less complex task, as the speakers could draw upon the range of linguistic knowledge in order to share this experience. The second task was a picture narrative, which they were asked to describe an 8-frame picture story, which you can see on the screen. The picture story is slightly more complex because we're beginning to put constraints on the language that they can use. They are required to use the information that is provided to them in the story. The final task was an integrated task in which they were asked to complete a short reading, listen to a short recording, and integrate information from both of these stimuli into a prompt. So now the most complex task, given the fact that they're being required to use specific information and integrate it within a response. Their speech was presented to 10 experienced English language instructors who resided in Montreal, Quebec, but were English dominant. And the listeners were asked to rate them for both accentedness and comprehensibility, as well as a range of linguistic measures, all of which were chosen because they had been shown in previous research to inform how comprehensible a speaker is perceived to be. So we considered not just phonological considerations, but lexical, grammatical, and discourse as well. And they rated them all on 1,000-point continuous sliding scales. This is the closest approximation I could find from my notes, but on the computer, they would have seen a cursor in the middle of the scale, which they could slide left or right. So the findings, I'll just go over each of the 3 studies really quickly and not dwell too much. But in the first finding, we found that the linguistic measures or characteristics that were associated with accentedness and comprehensibility differed based on a speaker's first language. For example, the comprehensibility of our Mandarin participants was tied solely to their accuracy of segmental production. Those who were more accurate in the production of individual sounds were perceived as being more comprehensible. This is probably one of the more intuitive findings that we could think of. You know, the more accurate our pronunciation in individual sounds, the more comprehensible we'll be. However, our Hindi speakers, our L1 Hindi speakers, were very different. Their comprehensibility was not associated with any phonological consideration. How comprehensible they were perceived to be was tied directly to their lexical and the grammatical choices and accuracy during their production. So the finding of this first study was really that how comprehensible listeners perceive a speaker to be is tied to different characteristics depending on the speaker's first language. The follow-up study was focusing on task complexity, and what we found was that on the more complex task, we saw greater associations for grammar and lexical characteristics in how comprehensible the speaker was. So on the long-term task, the task that I mentioned where speakers had access to their entire linguistic repertoire, how comprehensible they were was primarily tied to their phonological production. The argument being that since they could use their entire repertoire, they were able to pull grammar and vocabulary that they were highly familiar with, and therefore it was going to have less of an effect on their comprehensibility. But as task complexity increased, as they were forced to use language they were less familiar with, comprehensibility was no longer tied to just their phonological production, but also their grammatical and lexical production as well. And this was echoed in the third study, but what becomes very interesting in the third study is that on the most complex task, listeners' perception of how accented the speaker was also associated with grammar and vocabulary, which I think for many of us is sort of an unintuitive notion, since accent typically we link to how a speaker sounds. But here, very interestingly, we start to see that what influences my perception of a speaker's accent versus what influences my perception of a speaker's comprehensibility doesn't differ as much, because grammar and lexicon appear to, at times, influence how accented a speaker is. And we'll see in research beyond, and I saw there were a couple comments that came in, and I just have a couple more slides and we'll have a chance to discuss those comments. So coming out of the research I just discussed, you'll find that a lot of these findings seem to be shadowed by research in the non-English languages. So Annie Bergeron and Pavel Trofimovich found that a listener's perception of the comprehensibility of second language French learners were task specific, similar to what we just noticed. And Lappin Fortin, looking more specifically on what components of speech led to decreased comprehensibility, found associations between L2 French speakers' production of nasal vowels, consonants, and measures of fluency. And I'm placing fluency in blue font here because you're going to start seeing this word come up quite a bit, and we'll delve into that in a little bit. Mary O'Brien's work into German, comprehensibility rated more positively than accentedness and measures of perception of fluency, but also found that comprehensibility ratings were associated with a combination of, again, fluency, which should be in blue font, and grammar, similar to what we were seeing a moment ago. Kazuya Saito and his colleagues have been looking into second language Japanese comprehensibility, and associations are diverse. But again, we have vocabulary, pitch, which is a measure of intonation, and speech rate, with speech rate, a measure of fluency, the strongest predictor of comprehensibility improvement over time. Dan Isbell and his colleagues were looking at a pedagogical intervention study. So to what extent could we improve comprehensibility over time through instruction? An improvement was varied based on the task being performed. So again, an effective task, and also the initial proficiency of the learners. And probably the language that's received the most focus beyond English is Spanish, the work of Charlie Nagel and Amanda Hunch. Again, comprehensibility, despite the presence of a foreign accent, a speaker can still be comprehensible despite the presence of a foreign accent. But we see that comprehensibility is associated with a range of features, both phonological, fluency-based, and grammatical. So in general, accentedness has been linked primarily to pronunciation measures and fluency, whereas comprehensibility, we have seen it's more than just pronunciation. It's pronunciation, lexical, and grammatical considerations. And the research has shown that different measures of fluency, of temporal fluency, appear to be a frequent predictor of how comprehensible a speaker is perceived to be. And this is not surprising if we consider fluency at a more cognitive level, which I will get into in a little bit. But we have to interpret these findings in light of differences between speakers, their language background, the amount of training they've received, as well as the tasks they are performing. Now, the one consideration here, and this is where my more recent research interests come into play, is this body of research that I have discussed in English, in a range of non-English languages, has focused primarily on monologic speech. I elicit speech from a speaker, I play that speech to a listener, that listener assigns a scalar reading or a scalar rating. However, for many of us who are learning a second and a foreign language, we want to be able to use that language in spontaneous communication. So Munro and Derwing, in revisiting their 1995 publication, and I can hear my voice going on me. So Munro and Derwing, in revisiting their 1995 publication, talked about the need for ecological validity to start considering interactive speech. So interactive speech, in terms of intelligibility at a broad level, has considered what it is that leads to communicative breakdowns. This is how they've typically looked at intelligibility. They will analyze breakdowns in communication to indicate what seems to be the source of that breakdown during interaction. Research has shown that grammatical and lexical considerations tend to lead to more breakdowns than do phonological errors. Given that comprehensibility, which we've been discussing, is tied to both phonological and lexical grammatical considerations, this shouldn't be a surprise. However, when we look at the source of phonological breakdowns in interaction, we see a very significantly strong emphasis on segmental errors lead to breakdowns in communication, whereas supersegmental errors appear to lead to very few breakdowns in communication. All right, so to investigate this a little bit further, a recent publication in the Journal of Second Language Pronunciation, I tried to apply this more monologic discussion of comprehensibility, but apply it to interactive speech. And what I found was that on a continuum of complexity, you can see here the most significant correlations between linguistic characteristics and comprehensibility in each task. You can see the correlations increase as the task becomes more complex. And these significant correlations are all measures of temporal fluency. So the amount of language produced in a total utterance, as well as the number of syllables produced between two pauses. So comprehensibility, again, evidence that how fluently a speaker is able to produce a response seems to greatly influence our perception of how comprehensible that speaker is. So summarizing this recent study, a primary emphasis on fluency measures seem to predict comprehensibility, and the more complex the speaking task, the more important the ability to deliver a response fluently seemed to be. The argument here that increased linguistic constraints led to more difficulties for certain speakers. So those who were able to work within these constraints more effectively produced more fluent speech, which led them to being more comprehensible speakers. All right, I'll just take a moment before we look at what this could mean potentially for pedagogy, because I think a couple of messages came up in the chat. Oh, typed in the wrong place.
But does
Okay.
anybody
Yes.
have any questions for Dustin at this point about the research that he just presented? This is all really fascinating.
All right, so I think we have about 10 minutes or so left. So I'm going to try and, so one thing I'll say before I go back to shared screen, and I realized this in preparing this presentation, I talked at the outset, research informing pedagogy. One of the limitations I think in existing research is, and not everyone's research, but one of the limitations is we often we state pedagogical implications and make suggestions without necessarily investigating how, practical or how well our suggestions work. And so I know when I was preparing this presentation, my thought was basically what I've just told everyone here is when it comes to speech comprehensibility, it appears that almost everything matters, right? We see that, segmental production seems to inform comprehensibility, super segmentals inform comprehensibility, lexical and grammatical considerations. So I'm going to try and provide a little bit of guidance in the next discussion that is more than just teach everything. So if anyone's wondering what the heck is this guy talking about, it is a potential limitation in some of the research we have done where we have said this. Yes, I see a hand was raised.
Mijong, go ahead.
Yes. Well, my understanding is very slow.
Sure.
Sorry about that. So you mentioned about during the interactive speech, there are breakdowns, and there are two kinds of breakdowns, like grammar and lexical, phonological, and versus the segmental, super segmental. And can you give me the examples of each of them? And also, so is that kind of breakdown is happen among the speakers or the listeners when they are comprehending that the speaker was speaking?
Sure. So yeah, I realized originally I hadn't included that slide in the presentation. And then when I was revising the back half of my presentation, I should really bring this up because it is where my research is going. The vast majority of the research I've discussed has always been eliciting a listener's perception of monologic speech. So I record you speaking for 30 seconds to a minute to 2 minutes. I'm not part of that production. There's only one speaker. And then I play that speech for a listener, and we analyze the scalar rating that is assigned, and we do correlation. So I'll go through, okay, I think they made X number of segmental errors in this utterance. And then I'll run a correlation. Are they associated? Interactions methodologically has been very different. A researcher will bring in a pair of non-native users of the language, have them engage in an interaction, and then what they will do is they'll look at the interaction and they'll identify moments in the interaction where it seems that communication broke down. Then they will look at that moment and in the discourse. So for example, through the use of conversation analysis, see if they can identify what it was in that discourse that led to the breakdown in communication, or they will show a video of the breakdown in communication to the participants and ask for their reflections. In this moment, what was leading to the difficulty in understanding? So it's a very, very different methodology than we were seeing in the vast majority of intelligibility and comprehensibility research. My interest was, well, is there a way to sort of bridge these two areas of research, right? If we want to promote comprehensibility, don't we want to promote it within meaningful interactive usage of the language? So the findings here, whereas research on monologic speech indicated that both segmental production and super segmental production, so the prosodic elements of speech, so in English, word stress, sentence stress, the rise and fall of pitch, can make speech more difficult to understand if they're used incorrectly. in communicative breakdowns, well, it seems that it's a segmental error that leads to a breakdown more so than word stress, sentence stress, or intonation. However, in this research, the majority of breakdowns are usually based on vocabulary or grammatical choices. So hopefully that sort of clarifies that, because I know I went through that really, really quickly. It's two very different approaches, but to me, it doesn't make much sense. And we are starting to see in the field more and more scholars trying to get at intelligibility and comprehensibility within interactions. My former supervisor, Pavel Trofimovich, and his current students have been looking at dynamic assessment where listeners are asked to assign ratings throughout a 3-4 minute utterance, and they can increase the rating or decrease the rating at different times, asking speaking partners to provide comprehensibility ratings throughout a task. So they interact for 20 minutes, every 3 minutes, can you assign a rating for your speaking partner? So we're making attempts, but we're still trying to find the best way to do this. All right, other questions or thoughts before? Okay, I will go into the last part and then we'll have time for some discussion afterwards. Everyone can, yeah, we're good. Okay, I see the shared screen sign up top. All right, so I'll talk about this under 3 points. Segmental or supersegmental emphasis, understanding fluency in reference to pedagogy and speaking in the classroom, and then what's the role of task and how can it help us in terms of promoting comprehensibility in the classroom. So I mentioned at the outset that in Levis 2005, he talked about there being a nativeness principle and an intelligibility principle. In the nativeness principle, we saw a primarily segmental focus when it came to the teaching of pronunciation. And what has happened is now that we have evidence that for comprehensibility, there is support that supersegmentals impact how easy or difficult a speaker is to understand, we've seen a number of proposals in scholarship that have argued for supersegmental over segmental accuracy. I just want to be very clear that this is not at all what the research has been telling us when it comes to teaching pronunciation to promote intelligible, comprehensible speech. And it's sort of a misinterpretation that we don't have to teach segmentals anymore. We should focus all our time on supersegmentals. And we're seeing a little bit of a pullback now to finding a middle ground. So I don't think this is unusual in movements we often see in the world where we overcompensate and then have to find and pull ourselves back a little bit. But there was a moment for a while where we left segmental teaching behind and tried to focus on supersegmentals, at least in terms of what research was advocating for. However, we're at the point now where we need to understand that we need to look at both segmental and supersegmental production when we're addressing pronunciation in the classroom. Both require pedagogical emphasis. Now, as we know pronunciation instruction can be effective. There is more than enough research that shows that we can teach pronunciation and it can improve a learner's pronunciation. It's more likely to improve intelligibility in the broad sense than it is to remove a foreign language accent or a foreign accent. Explicit instruction is likely necessary, but probably more so for higher level learners than it is for lower level learners. Research has shown that learners can make pretty significant gains in the pronunciation early in their learning, but they're likely to hit a threshold or a plateau, and that is when explicit instruction will benefit them. And for me, sometimes I think explicit instruction comes in when they can produce comprehensible speech, but they still want to try and push for something akin to native-like pronunciation. So it's sort of along the lines of, you've gotten this far, which is great. This is a great place to be. Now let's see if we can take you a step further. There is room for explicit instruction for earlier for learners, but we want to choose very carefully where we place that. And I'll come back to that in a moment. One of the critiques that exists in the literature when it comes to pronunciation specifically is that a lot of language teachers, language instructors, educators aren't trained to teach pronunciation in the programs they take. This has been well documented amongst English language teachers, but Amanda Hunch has done some work recently looking at university American university instructors of French, Spanish, and German who have limited knowledge on how to teach pronunciation, and this will often lead to a strong focus on segmental production in the classroom. That's not necessarily bad, focusing on segments, if we know what we are doing. I think we can all agree, research shows that we spend a limited amount of classroom time on the teaching of pronunciation. Usually it's sort of an in-the-moment correction or a short activity at the beginning or the end of a class. Given the limited time spent on pronunciation in the classroom, Derwing Munro identified the need to focus on properties with high error gravity. So in this case, they're referring to, if we're going to teach pronunciation in the classroom, trying to teach those aspects of speech that are going to lead to decreased comprehensibility and decreased intelligibility. So basically, we don't need to teach every sound. And one of the guiding principles that we're seeing more and more discussion on in the literature is an idea of functional load. And if you're not familiar, functional load is really referring to the fact that different minimal pairs of sounds differentiate between a different number of words. So in English, the phonemes P and B would have what we call a high functional load because they differentiate between a large number of words. So the examples here, P, B, pit, bit, pet, bet, pat, bat. All of these are meaningful words in the language. However, for learners in English who potentially replace a TH sound with a D, so a sentence like, look at that versus look at dat would be considered low functional load because there really isn't a meaningful replacement there. Despite saying dat instead of that, it's still highly comprehensible because there really isn't another word that I could be referring to in that case. So if we are going to be teaching individual sounds in the classroom, we want to be focusing on those sounds which carry a high functional load because these tend to be more detrimental to comprehensibility than words with low functional load. And so if you are curious, what minimal pairs seem to carry a high functional load, Catford 87 and in a number of subsequent publications, the work of Munro and Derwing, Kim Kong's work has looked at this as well over the years, have given us a really nice list of the minimal pairs that tend to carry high functional load. Just looking for the sake of time. In terms of what we do in the classroom, I think we've all have experience teaching minimal pairs. Oftentimes we'll do repeat after me exercises. We might do paired exercises where learners choose one of two words and they see if their partner can actually identify which word they were trying to articulate. And this kind of work can help with both controlled perceptual and productive development, but there's questions to what extent controlled practice transfers over to spontaneous production when we remove the meaningful aspect of language use, right? So a lot of learners will often be able to show greater improvement in the accuracy of individual sounds in a controlled task when they are provided with the information that they are to produce. But once they're asked to produce speech in a spontaneous situation, a lot of those gains aren't necessarily realized. So I talked earlier about fluency, and I want to come back to this point because it's all tied together. So spontaneous production requires a number of cognitive processes in the mind. So I'm adapting this from the work of Levis and Debot, but typically when we produce a spontaneous production, we're looking at the conceptualization of a preverbal message, the need to access the vocabulary, to provide a grammatical shape, to realize what the phonological score is going to look like, and then the speaker has to articulate the score. In controlled practice, we're ultimately eliminating much of the conceptualizer and the formulator and really allowing learners to focus on the articulation of a production. So Norman Segalowitz refers to this as cognitive fluency, the operation of planning and assembling the functions of an utterance and then integration and execution. So in controlled speech, we don't have to go through this entire process, which may explain why we don't necessarily see controlled practice transfer over to spontaneous speech. So within Sigalowicz's model, he talks about cognitive fluency and then utterance fluency. And utterance fluency are these temporal measures that I have referenced at different times in the presentation: articulation rate, mean length of run, speech rate. And these temporal measures reflect the impact of cognitive fluency on the underlying speech production process. So we can focus on controlled practice, which will lead to gains in pronunciation abilities, but we also have to be able to provide learners opportunities to practice in meaningful language contexts. And so, where am I now? That should not have popped up as quickly as it did. So a recent study by Charlie Nagel on the learning of second language Spanish speech took a commutative-based approach across a pair of semesters, and he measured comprehensibility before and after the semester. What's important here is that in this commutative-based classroom, there was no explicit pronunciation instruction, yet the learners still showed pre to post improvement in both how native-like their speech was, but also how comprehensible their speech was. Theoretically, this falls in line with an interactive approach to language development. Learners gain exposure to the language, they gain productive practice, and they gain feedback. You could theoretically argue that the more they're able to use the language, the more they're automatizing the process in order to produce an utterance, right? And this practice allows them to increase the fluency in cognitive retrieval. So automatizing the process and the way to produce an utterance leads to increased fluency, which leads to more fluid output, which leads to perceptions of greater comprehensibility. So I talked earlier how comprehensibility is seemingly associated with not just phonological considerations, but grammatical and lexical. If we view the cognitive processes of forming an utterance as requiring access to grammar, lexicon, and pronunciation, it makes sense that we see these strong associations between fluency and how comprehensible speech is meant to be. So we also saw that task affected how comprehensible a speaker is, and we're seeing a number of suggestions now that when trying to promote comprehensibility development in the classroom, there's a need to provide learners with the opportunity to engage in a range of meaningful language production tasks. So if a learner is struggling in comprehensibility, doing more complex tasks can actually get them to focus on a range of linguistic targets that are likely to help them develop the comprehensibility of their speech. Whereas if they perform a simple task like sharing an experience, it's not going to require them to really focus on those cognitive processes that allow them to promote comprehensibility speech on more complex tasks. And I realize for the sake of time, I'm probably moving a little bit too quickly through this argument, but I'll try and summarize this in my final thoughts here. And then we can discuss a bit more in the discussion afterwards if you would like. So summarizing the presentation, increased emphasis on intelligible over native-like speech as a target of L2 learning. One measure of broad intelligibility is comprehensibility, which measures the effort required by a listener to understand a given speaker. This looks at how comprehensible a speaker is influenced by a range of measures: individual sounds, prosody, grammar, vocabulary, utterance fluency, which reflects learners' underlying speech production process, appears to influence comprehensibility across target languages. Right? So knowing this, controlled pronunciation practice can help promote the development of comprehensible speech. However, learners do appear to require meaningful engagement in the target language in order to gain more comprehensible speech in spontaneous usage. And thus, given the range of measures that influence comprehensibility, an appropriate range of meaning-based tasks is necessary. Tasks that are going to force listeners to rely on not only the language that they are highly familiar with, but also language and formulation processes that they are less familiar with. So thank you everyone for having me today. And you can see my email there if you'd like to contact me. And I look forward to any questions and discussions that you may have for us. So mahalo. Thank you.
Wonderful, Dustin. Thank you so much for this really interesting overview of the research and the pedagogical implications that we can take into our classrooms.